How do you tell them science looking at responding to change? Thanks to Sam Moyle for producing this PowerPoint. So our science understandings: organisms detect and respond to changes in the internal and external environment. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment. This ensures optimum conditions for the body to function. In human beings, homeostasis depends upon the functioning of the nervous and endocrine systems. Homeostasis involves a stimulus response and negative feedback model. Describe the role of sensory receptors, describe the role of effectors, explain the stimulus response model, and recognize that in negative feedback, their response inhibits the initial stimulus. So, dealing with change. Your body detects changes to the environment, both internally and externally. And failure to adapt to a change, either internal or externally, can be very bad for you and your body cells. So here's a question: what happens when you are cold? So, when you're cold, your body detects a change in temperature. Various systems then go to work to warm you up. We've got shivering, for example, which is managed by the nervous system. So your muscles contract, that burns sugar. More burning of sugar leads to more heat energy being released, which warms you up. There's an endocrine system response too, where a hormone called thyroxine is released, and that tells your body to burn more sugar all over it. So more sugar is burned, more heat energy is released, that warms you up internally. And then we've got behavioural changes as well. Key thing is we've got nervous system working and we've got the endocrine system, and they're both trying to keep you at a nice steady temperature. So the coordination system is a loop. We have an action and we have a reaction, and this continually cycles around to maintain our body at particular levels of things like temperature, pH, glucose, oxygen, waste levels, water levels. So we have inputs and outputs that regulate each other so that we maintain a specific level within our bodies, and that's homeostasis. So let's look at a definition of homeostasis. It's the state of steady internal physical and chemical conditions which are maintained by living systems. By keeping conditions within the tolerance limits, the organism can continue to do the chemical reactions of life efficiently. As soon as you move outside of tolerance limits, you reduce the effectiveness of the chemical reactions. So, if you do go outside the tolerance limits, homeostatic mechanisms might be able to shift you back in towards the tolerance limits. So we had our body temperature here, where if you get cold, you do some things. If you get too hot, you do some things as well. Either way, what you're trying to do is you're trying to maintain yourself at that nice specific 37 and a bit degrees Celsius that we have inside our bodies. Down here's a little image showing what homeostasis is. So we detect there's a change in the environment, either internally or externally. That's picked up by a receptor. The information is then sent to a control center which determines an effect that needs to happen. That effect is carried out by an effector, and that leads to a change in the body so that the homeostatic mechanism shifts so that we get back to being at level. So, too cold, picked up by temperature receptors, control center in the brain says do things like shiver, do things like release thyroxine. That information is sent to effectors, so the muscles would be the effector in terms of shivering. The thyroid gland is the effector in terms of thyroxine release. That leads to your body warming up to get you back to being warm again. Decrease in temperature leads to an increase in temperature. And that's our action-reaction sequence. We're doing something, we're getting an effect, and then that leads to a change, and then that change might be reducing the effect later on. As I said, this is moderated by nerves and hormones, so we maintain specific concentrations or balance or environments. And our bodies are particularly good at this in terms of things like blood glucose levels, carbon dioxide levels, body temperature, which I've been talking about, and water and solute levels. To get this balance, coordination, and control, there is communication between organs and systems, and this is done by nerves and hormones. So the communication systems we have in our body break down to being either nervous or hormonal. In terms of nerves, we have a system of cells, a network of cells that can talk to each other using electrochemical impulses. In hormones, particular parts of the body produce chemicals which are released into the blood. They travel around the body to specific cells that can detect those chemicals. When those chemicals are detected, that changes the function of the cell. That's what happens in the endocrine system, what hormones do. Some of the systems that are homeostatic, they can be either nervous or hormonal or a combination of both. And as we go through our systems, we'll determine where we're looking at nervous system response, where we're looking at an endocrine system response. So let's compare the action of the nervous and hormonal systems, or endocrine system I should say, not hormonal. In the nervous system we have these cells called neurons. They have these long parts called axons, which allow the cell to be quite long and communicate between parts of the body that are distant from each other. It's electrochemical impulse. It's very specific. So a muscle will contract when you are shivering, not your entire body's muscles. That would be quite bad. Nerves are fast, and the duration of the effect is very short term. Once the nerve impulse is gone, then the body should return back to what it was doing before the nerve impulse was there. The endocrine system, it's indirect. So you'd release chemicals in the blood, they float around in the circulatory system until they bump into a cell that has a receptor for that hormone. So there's a chemical messaging system, and multiple cells of different types around the body can be targeted by a single hormone. Because you have to produce the hormone, release it into the circulatory system, and wait for the circulatory system to move the chemicals around the body is quite slow. But it can also be long-term, so you can have long-term effects from the slow release. Let's talk about the stimulus response pathway. So a stimulus is detected by a receptor. From the receptor, the message is conveyed to a control center, and the control center triggers a response to the stimulus by activating an effector. What the effector does is it removes the stimulus, or it initiates an action that negates the stimulus. And that gets us back to our balance, so we restore back to our status quo, which could be very complex like osmoregulation, or it could be very simple like removing your hand from a flame, and this is the one that we normally go through in Year 9. We're going to talk about reflexes a bit later on, but let's talk about this in terms of a reflex. So the stimulus is heat energy being detected by thermoreceptors in your skin. You're burning your skin. So in this case, you would have sensory neurons taking the information from the receptor to the central nervous system in the spinal column, which is the control center. The control center will then send a response through a motor neuron to an effector, which would be the big muscle in your arm, so that you pull your hand away from the flame. So we're removing the stimulus, which is the large amount of heat energy being detected by our thermoreceptor, so that we're not going to be burning ourselves as much. So we have a stimulus, which is producing a change in the status quo. It might be not enough oxygen in your blood, for example. That information goes to a receptor, so we have receptors that pick up things like carbon dioxide levels and oxygen levels in our brains. That information is then sent to a control center, so again, this is a big part of our brain if we're looking at oxygen levels. The brain will then send a signal to an effector, so something like the muscles in your diaphragm, to tell your body to breathe more. If you're breathing more, you'll get more oxygen in and more carbon dioxide out. That leads to a change which should then reduce the amount of stimulus, so it should reduce the low oxygen levels, for example, if I need to breathe more. So we're reducing the stimulus, or negating the stimulus, and then we get back to our status quo. We've got words like afferent and efferent here. We're going to learn about them a bit later on. So stimulus and response, they're vital for coordination, and that means that any changes that are happening externally and internally need to be monitored and regulated, because an external change can lead to an internal change, which could then move our systems outside of their tolerance limits, which would lead to bad things happening to our cells. Sudden changes also might need a response. So we're going to look at reflex systems in a little bit, looking at how reflexes reduce stimuli really, really quickly without needing too much processing. The way the detection happens is through sensory receptors. So those receptors send signals to the central nervous system, which then leads to a response. Let's look at some of those sensory receptors. So we've got photoreceptors, which pick up light. These are found in your eyes. Chemoreceptors are things like pH, oxygen, taste, smell. Some pain as well can be done through chemoreceptors. Thermoreceptors pick up high temperatures and low temperatures. And mechanoreceptors pick up pressure, osmolarity, sound, balance. So if it's mechanical, this is where we're look at some deformation of the cell, which leads to a change in its function. So these are sensory receptors, and they're dotted around your body in different places, picking up different types of information. So as we said, homeostasis is a feedback loop. It controls and regulates the internal environment. We call those mechanisms homeostatic control mechanisms, and the way that it works is through a system called negative feedback. So what happens in negative feedback is the output of the system becomes the input for the system, and that should lead to a reduction in the stimulus that we're experiencing. So it gets us back to our status quo. It's self-regulating, so whatever change we make leads to a system change that we can then detect, and if that system check isn't enough, then we have more of that system happening. If it's too much, then we reduce that amount until we get back to our balance point. Let's have a look at how this works in terms of blood sugar just briefly. So negative feedback, it's a response that results in an inhibition of a stimulus. So the output of our change leads to a reduction in the input of a change, and this continues until we reach balance. So a good example of this is blood glucose levels or blood sugar levels being controlled by insulin and glucagon. So you eat a meal, you get a large amount of glucose floating around your blood, that's a stimulus. So too much glucose in your blood can be quite bad. The receptors pick up that change in blood glucose. So these are chemoreceptors. They convey a message to the control center in the pancreas, leads to the pancreas secreting insulin to the blood. That's our effector, so the pancreas is our effector. The insulin floats around the body and it hits cells with insulin receptors, and it tells those cells to absorb glucose from the blood. So that reduces the sugar level in the blood, and it leads to less sugar in the blood, which reduces our stimulus. So now we're not going to produce as much insulin because we've reduced the blood glucose level. So that's our negative feedback. If the blood sugar levels are too low, glucagon is released, and that causes cells to release glucose into the blood. So now we've got not enough sugar, so we've got a system that's going to increase our blood sugar level. When the blood sugar levels are back within the happy limits, then glucagon release is reduced. So we don't want to just keep on releasing sugar into the blood, because that could be quite bad. We can get back to our having too much sugar again. So we've got systems that are balancing out our blood sugar level, and they rely on that negative feedback. Right, so we've got high blood sugar. We've eaten a meal, we've got lots of sugar floating around our blood. That leads to the pancreas releasing insulin. If it releases insulin, that stimulates the uptake of glucose from the blood, and that reduces the amount of glucose present in the blood because it's being absorbed into cells. That lowers the blood sugar. If the blood sugar level gets too low, that leads to glucagon being released by the pancreas, which leads to more glycogen breaking down to release glucose, so that glucose goes back into the blood level, and that leads to the blood sugar level increasing. These act to balance out big peaks and troughs in blood glucose level so that our blood glucose level is pretty consistent most of the time. So let's look at our model for this. So stimulus is a increase in blood sugar, for example. That leads to that's being detected by a receptor. So it's the chemoreceptor that picks up the blood glucose level. That leads to an information being passed on to the control center in the brain, which leads to information being sent to the pancreas to say release insulin, which leads to cells uptaking glucose from the blood, which leads to a reduction in the amount of glucose in the blood by reducing our stimulus. So let's do our check. So organisms detect and respond to changes in the internal and external environment. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment. This ensures optimal conditions for the body to function. In human beings, homeostasis depends on the nervous and endocrine systems. Homeostasis involves stimulus response and feedback models. Describe the role of sensory receptors, describe the role of effectors, explain the stimulus response model, and recognize in negative feedback the response inhibits the initial stimulus. Today on Flipping Science, we'll look at responding to change. That's the Flipping Science today. See ya.